Hi, thank you, everyone. So just have to say this work was done in EPFL during my PhD, but now I'm a postdoc at Microsoft. So this was my last work, PhD at EPFL. So we're talking about natural image synthesis for the variational information bottleneck representation. So the motivation for this application is based for neuroscience, but you can imagine that this thing could be applied to any black box input-output optimization. So imagine that in a neuroscience discipline, you have these input images that input on the retina. This information would pass on and produce some output signals. For example, at the retina ganglion cell, like some spikes. And these spikes then go downstream in the cortex and produce a perception. For example, an observer is looking at the images of a trees and it would produce a perception of a tree. So then we were asking that if you look at these input images, they're very high dimensional, 2D images, high dimensional, natural looking, and they're in time, so time varying. We were asking, is there all the visual information really required to explain the neural responses, the responses that we get out of the system? And you could put it in another question as whether is there a lower complexity stimuli that could similarly activate the neurons in the sense that the high dimensional input images activated the neurons in the first place. So our contribution in this work is using information bottleneck Gaussian process and introducing that model for joint learning of the input and output, input being stimuli and the retinal neural responses. They were doing some latent analysis of how the joint model of these input outputs would look like. Then we used the model that we developed and in a closed-loop image synthesis algorithm to come up with these simpler, not much complex inputs that would similarly activate the outputs. So we will briefly go to the framework here. So the framework is quite similar to an encoder and decoder with some latent space. The inputs are, as I said earlier, high-dimensional input images. So our objective is to compress the input images to a latent space as much as possible by minimizing the mutual information between the input and the latent space, and at the same time, maximizing the mutual information between the latent space and the output. So compress as much as possible, but still to the level that you want the output to be best represented. So this work was not that novel. It was information bottleneck principle, but what our contribution was adding some latent prior to this work, and it was incorporating the correlation between the high-dimensional input images. As you look at the inputs, they are very correlated, not only in time, because as you would look at some scenery, the images that would go through the brain, they are very much similar because of the saccade of the eye and jittering. And also the natural-looking images are quite similar. So we put this prior in the latent space, that the latent space should be coming from a multivariate normal or Gaussian process with a correlated covariance matrix. So that is IBGP model, and then we compare it to another model which does not take into account this correlation of the input images and the outputs, and we compare both models. So the IBGP and IB disjoint, as you look at the output responses, both can quite similarly produce or predict the output responses of the inputs, and we observed that they are showing favorable results compared to the state-of-the-art models for this input-output modeling in the retina compared to fully convolutional neural network with no latent space. But if you take a closer look at the latent space of these two models, we can see that in the one that there was this prior of the correlation of the images, IBGP, the latent space information is not spread out over all the latent variables. That's what we're seeing in the top row, whereas in the other one, the information is spread out over all the latent variables. And as you can see, you can do some further complexity reduction of these inputs outputs, and you can see the images are quite spread out over the space. Then you can use this thing in a closed-loop image synthesis. So the idea was we have these high-dimensional inputs. Is there this question mark that here another input image that would produce the same outputs? So you can formulate this problem as with a loss function, meaning that you want the output to be represented best. You want this lower complexity stimuli be from the same space of the original inputs, and another constraint that they have to be quite smooth. So if you do that, then you can look at the images. What you're seeing here on the top row is the original images, cropped images from the high-dimensional, natural-looking images. And you would see that this lower complexity stimuli that you're seeing on the second row and the third row, which is the second row is a zoomed-in version of the third row. These types of input stimuli would produce the same response as the high complex ones. And they are validated by being between the receptive fields of the neuron. So the networks and the procedure is not hallucinating something. It's just giving out the correct response. So, and with that, I would conclude. You can apply this to any other black box input-output model. We just showed it for this discipline, but it's applicable to any other as well. Thank you.